That's my wife. She dove through the closing doors, crashed into someone. He didn't move, just pressed a button. The doors sealed. She looked up, saw the tattoo on his neck, the blood on his sleeve, eyes that belonged to something dangerous. Wrong elevator. And now there's no way out. If you love intense Afro-Korean romance stories, subscribe to Ebony and Pearl's Stories. You won't want to miss what happens next.
The marble floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel was so polished Sienna could see her reflection in it, distorted and wavering, just like she felt inside. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the pastry boxes stacked in her arms, the cardboard corners digging into her palms hard enough to hurt. She focused on that pain, anything to distract from the growing panic clawing at her chest. She'd been delivering custom desserts to this hotel for 3 months now, always through the service entrance, always invisible. Today, the kitchen staff had redirected her through the main lobby because of some plumbing emergency in the back corridors. Of course, because my life wasn't complicated enough without walking through a space where Tony might see me. The lobby stretched before her like a gauntlet, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that caught light and threw it around like confetti. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh lilies from the massive floral arrangement on the center table. Her sneakers squeaked slightly on that perfect floor, announcing her presence, marking her as someone who didn't belong here. She kept her head down, counting steps. 23 to the elevators. Then she could vanish up to the penthouse kitchen, deliver her macarons and tartlets, collect her payment, and disappear back into her small, safe world. 23 steps. She could manage that. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and drop a comment. Let me know you're here. Sienna. The voice froze her mid-step. Her stomach dropped. That familiar tenor with its slight whine at the edges turned her blood to ice water. She didn't turn around. Maybe if she kept walking, he'd think he was mistaken. Maybe reality would bend just this once in her favor. Sienna, wait. I know that's you. Footsteps behind her. Quick and determined. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she clutched the pastry boxes tighter and walked faster. 15 steps to the elevators. Just 15 more steps. Don't you dare ignore me. His hand clamped on her shoulder, spinning her around with enough force that she nearly dropped her carefully balanced boxes. Tony looked exactly as he had 6 months ago when she'd finally escaped. Sandy hair styled with too much product. Pale blue eyes that had once seemed kind but now just looked calculating. He wore an expensive suit, probably bought with his parents' money since he'd never held a job longer than 3 months. The familiar scent of his overwrought cologne made her stomach turn. I need to make my delivery, she said, proud that her voice only shook slightly. Please let me go. Let you go? His laugh was sharp, bitter. Like you let me go? Just vanished one day, blocked my number, refused to answer the door. We were supposed to get married, Sienna. We were never supposed to get married. She took a step back, trying to put distance between them. I gave your ring back. I explained everything in my letter. Your letter? He spat the words like they tasted foul. 2 years together, and you end it with a letter? Do you have any idea how that made me look? How my mother reacted? How everyone at the club laughed behind my back? The thing about Tony was that everything always circled back to him, to his image, to how things affected his standing with people whose opinions shouldn't matter. She'd spent 2 years trying to shrink herself small enough to fit into his vision of the perfect girlfriend, baking elaborate desserts for his networking events, smiling through his subtle criticisms about her appearance, her career, her friends. The day she'd moved into her own tiny apartment above the bakery where she worked, taking only what she'd brought into the relationship, had been the first time she'd breathed freely in months. I'm sorry you were hurt, she said, aiming for calm despite her racing heart. But we weren't right for each other. You know that. What I know is that you owe me an explanation, a real one. face to face. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. Never hard enough to leave marks. Tony was too smart for that, but firm enough to communicate that she wasn't leaving until he allowed it. The boxes wobbled dangerously. You're going to make me drop these, and they're worth $300 that I can't afford to replace. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you humiliated me. Her vision narrowed, the lobby around them fading as her focus tunneled to his hand on her wrist, to the familiar sensation of being trapped. This was how it had always been. His needs, his feelings, his control disguised as care. I promise myself, never again. Never again would I let someone make me feel this small. Let go of me. The words came out stronger than she expected, sharp enough that a passing couple glanced their way. Tony's expression shifted, his grip loosening slightly, but not releasing. We're making a scene, Sienna. You hate scenes. Just come to the bar with me. We'll have a civilized conversation like adults. Then you can make your delivery. Her eyes darted past him, searching for help, for security, for anyone who might intervene. The hotel staff carefully looked away, trained to ignore minor disputes among guests and visitors. The well-dressed people in the lobby kept their distance, unwilling to involve themselves in someone else's drama. I was alone again. The realization galvanized her. She twisted sharply, breaking his grip with the move her friend had taught her in that self-defense class she'd taken after leaving him. The pastry boxes listed dangerously, but she managed to steady them as she spun away, her sneakers squeaking on that perfect marble as she lunged toward the elevators. Sienna. Tony's shout echoed through the lobby, his false civility shattered. She slammed her hand against the call button. Once, twice, 3 times, as if desperation could make the elevator arrive faster. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps gaining ground. No longer the measured stride of a man in control, but the angry pursuit of someone whose carefully constructed image had just cracked in public. The elevator chimed. That soft, mechanical sound was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. The brass doors began to slide open. Sienna didn't think, didn't look, didn't process anything except the shrinking space between her and Tony's reaching hand. She threw herself forward into the elevator, her shoulder slamming into something solid, immovable, and expensive smelling. Strong hands caught her arms, not grabbing, not controlling, just steadying, as her momentum carried her into a stranger's space. She looked up. Dark eyes met hers. Calm. Assessing. Utterly unshaken by the terrified woman who'd just crashed into him. The man was Korean. Tall. Navy suit that probably cost more than her car. Hair styled with deliberate precision. A face that belonged in boardrooms. Beautiful in that severe, untouchable way that suggested he'd never been desperate a day in his life. And behind her, Tony's voice. That's my wife. The stranger's gaze shifted past her shoulder, and something in his expression changed. Something cold. Something calculating. His hand moved economically efficient and pressed the door close button. The brass doors slid shut with a soft, final thud. Tony's face vanished. The elevator began to rise, and Sienna realized she hadn't escaped danger. She'd just walked straight into something far more complicated. If you're loving the story, subscribe to Ebony and Pearl Stories for more emotional Afro-Korean romance, and drop a comment telling us what time you're watching this. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed, the sound almost peaceful if Sienna's heart wasn't still trying to break through her ribcage. She collapsed against the mirrored wall, legs trembling so violently she wasn't sure they'd hold her much longer. Her chest heaved as she tried to drag air into her lungs, each breath coming out shaky and too loud in the enclosed space. I just threw myself at a complete stranger. I'm trapped in an elevator going God knows where. Tony is probably losing his mind in the lobby. What was I thinking? Are you hurt? The stranger's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, low, controlled, each word precisely formed with a Korean accent that made the English sound deliberate and careful. Sienna shook her head, then nodded, then pressed her hand over her mouth as a sound escaped that was half laugh, half sob. I'm sorry, she managed, her voice cracking. I didn't mean to. I just needed to get away from him. Your husband? He asked quietly, his dark eyes still fixed on her with that unsettling calm. Ex, Sienna said quickly, almost desperately. Or almost. We're finalizing the divorce. Today was supposed to be the last time I ever had to deal with him. The stranger said nothing, just continued watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not judgmental, not pitying, just assessing, like he was gathering information, filing it away for later use. The elevator jolted. Once. Twice. Then stopped. The sudden stillness made Sienna's stomach lurch. The overhead lights flickered, then dimmed to a muted emergency gold that cast everything in amber shadow. She let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't tasted so much like hysteria. Of course. Of course this would happen. The stranger, because that's all he was, a stranger she'd crashed into while running from her past, pulled out his phone. His movements were economical, efficient, like someone who never wasted energy on unnecessary gestures. He pressed a few buttons, his expression unchanging. No signal, he said finally, his voice betraying nothing. Not frustration, not concern, just stating a fact. He reached past her. Carefully, she noticed, making sure not to touch her, and pressed the emergency call button. Once. Twice. 3 times. Static crackled through the speaker, then nothing. We will be here a while, he said, sliding his phone back into his pocket with the same measured calm he'd maintained since she'd literally thrown herself into his space. Sienna slid down the wall until she was sitting on the elevator floor, her pastry boxes forgotten beside her. She hugged her knees to her chest, suddenly aware of how small this space was, how trapped she was, how her carefully rebuilt life had just collapsed in the span of 10 minutes. I'm sorry, she whispered again. You didn't ask for this. No, he agreed. Then more softly, but I'm here. He moved to the opposite wall and lowered himself to sit across from her, maintaining distance even in the confined space. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small bottle of water, the expensive kind hotels left in suites, and held it out to her. You should drink something, he said. Your breathing is too fast. Sienna took the bottle with shaking hands, grateful for something to focus on besides the walls closing in around her. The water was cool, clean, and she hadn't realized how dry her throat was until she took the first sip. Thank you, she said. Then, because the silence felt too heavy, I'm Sienna. Sienna Carrington. Taesung, he replied, inclining his head slightly in what might have been a bow if they weren't both sitting on an elevator floor. The formality of it struck her as oddly comforting. Like despite everything that had just happened, there were still rules, still structure. He's my ex-husband, she found herself saying, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Tony Martins. We were together for 2 years. I left him 6 months ago. Taesung said nothing, just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. He never hit me, Sienna continued, not sure why she was telling this stranger her life story, but unable to stop. People always ask that first. Like if there are no bruises, it doesn't count. But he didn't need to hit me. He just controlled everything. What I wore, who I talked to. He'd criticize me in front of his friends, then act like it was a joke when I got upset. He'd tell me I was too sensitive, that I didn't understand how the world worked. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she took another sip of water to steady herself. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I just became the person he wanted me to be, things would get better. But they never did. They just got smaller. I got smaller. And when you left? Taesung asked. His voice was still calm, but there was something in it now. Attention, maybe. Real attention. not just politeness. I moved into a tiny apartment above a bakery. Started my own dessert business. It's not much, but it's mine. Every decision, every choice mine. I thought I was free. She let out a bitter laugh. But he keeps finding me. Shows up at places he knows I'll be. Sends messages through mutual friends. Acts like I'm the unreasonable one for wanting space. For wanting to exist without him. Taesung was quiet for a long moment. Then Tony Martins. The way he said the name made Sienna look up. You know him? I know of him. Taesung corrected, his tone careful. His family has interests, business, ventures that occasionally intersect with my own. Something in the way he said interests made Sienna's skin prickle. What kind of business ventures? Taesung studied her, and she got the distinct impression he was deciding how much to tell her. The kind that required discretion. The kind where reputation matters. Tony's family has money, Sienna said slowly. Old money. His mother is always going on about their lineage, their connections. But I never really understood what they actually did. They facilitate things, Taesung said. For people who prefer their business arrangements to remain unofficial. The temperature in the elevator seemed to drop. Are you saying Tony's family is involved in something illegal? I'm saying, Taesung replied carefully, that Tony Martins has made noise in places where noise is unwise. That he has crossed lines that men in his position should know better than to cross. Sienna's heart rate kicked up again, but for a different reason now. How do you know all this? Taesung's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A calculation, a decision made. Because men like Tony fear consequences only when those consequences have teeth. And I am someone who provides clarity about consequences. The words were measured, almost gentle, but they hit Sienna like ice water. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman trapped in an elevator. This was power, real power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, because everyone who mattered already knew. Are you? She couldn't quite form the question, couldn't quite voice what her instincts were screaming at her. Dangerous? Taesung finished for her, his lips quirking in something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact, delivered in the same calm tone he'd used to offer her water. Sienna should have been terrified. Should have been scrambling for the emergency button, screaming for help, doing anything except sitting here calmly drinking water with a man who just admitted to being dangerous. But instead, she felt something unexpected. Relief. Because for the first time since Tony had appeared in that lobby, she wasn't the most vulnerable person in the room. He won't stop, she whispered. Even if I move again, even if I change my number, he thinks I belong to him. He'll keep coming. Taesung's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he will need to be corrected. The elevator shuddered, the lights flickering again. Taesung stood smoothly, instinctively positioning himself between Sienna and the doors. The movement was automatic, protective in a way that made her chest tighten. When we get out of here, he said, his voice low and certain, you will not have to run from Tony Martins again. What are you going to do? Sienna asked, not sure if she wanted to know the answer. Taesung looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. What needs to be done? The elevator lurched back to life, the lights snapping to full brightness. The car began its ascent again, numbers climbing on the display above the door. But Sienna barely noticed, because she just realized that walking out of this elevator with Taesung might save her from Tony. Or it might trap her in something far more dangerous than anything she'd escaped. The door slid open with a soft chime, and Sienna had to make a choice. If you're invested in Sienna's story, subscribe to Ebony and Pearl Stories and turn on notifications. There's so much more coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The elevator doors opened onto a marble-floored hallway that smelled of leather and money. Sienna didn't move. Taesung stood in the doorway, one hand holding the door sensor, waiting. Not rushing her. Not demanding. Just waiting. Beyond him, she could see a man in a black suit, younger, Korean, standing with a kind of rigid posture that suggested military training or something similar. When he saw Tae-sung, he bowed slightly, his eyes flicking to Sienna with barely concealed curiosity. Boss, the man said in Korean, then added in accented English. The car is ready when you are. Boss. The word hung in the air between them. Sienna's hands tightened on the water bottle Tae-sung had given her, the plastic crinkling under her grip. She looked at Tae-sung, really looked at him for the first time since she'd crashed into his face. The navy suit that fit like it had been tailored specifically for his frame. The way he held himself, spine straight but movements fluid, like someone who'd never doubted his right to occupy any space he entered. The faint scar she could now see at his collarbone, barely visible where his shirt collar opened, thin, precise, the kind of mark left by something sharp wielded with intent. And his eyes, dark, calm, assessing everything without revealing anything. This wasn't a businessman. This was something else entirely. You can walk out alone, Tae-sung said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears only. The lobby is 2 floors down. Hotel security will escort you to your car if you ask. Tony has likely been encouraged to leave by now. Encouraged? Sienna repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. My people made a phone call. Tony Martins is not welcome in this hotel anymore. My people. Just like that. One phone call, and Tony, who'd spent the last 6 months tracking her down, showing up wherever she went, refusing to accept that she'd left, was banned from a 5-star hotel. How did you? This is my hotel, Tae-sung said simply. One of several properties I own in this city. Of course it was. Sienna's mind raced, trying to reconcile the calm man in front of her with the implications of what he was telling her. People who owned multiple 5-star hotels. People who had people making phone calls that resulted in immediate action. People whose subordinates called them boss, with that particular tone of absolute deference. Or, Tae-sung continued, his gaze never leaving hers. You can walk with me. Have dinner. Discuss options that might interest you. Options, Sienna echoed. Solutions, he corrected. To a problem that will not resolve itself. Tony's face flashed in her mind, red with fury, shouting her name in that hotel corridor. The feeling of his hand gripping her wrist. The certainty in his voice when he'd said we need to talk like adults, as if her consent was irrelevant, as if her boundaries were negotiable. She thought about the last 6 months. The constant looking over her shoulder, changing her route to work, avoiding places they used to go together. The exhaustion of being hunted by someone who refused to accept that no meant no. Sienna stepped out of the elevator. Dinner, she said. And a conversation about these options. Something flickered in Tae-sung's eyes. Approval, maybe, or satisfaction, before his expression returned to that neutral calm. He gestured down the hallway, falling into step beside her. Not ahead, asserting dominance. Not behind, following. Beside her, like an equal. It was such a small thing. And yet after 2 years with Tony, who'd always walked ahead, expecting her to keep up, treating her like an accessory to his life rather than a person with her own pace, it felt monumental. The man in the black suit followed at a discreet distance, and Sienna noticed another man waiting by the private elevator at the end of the hall. Both moved with the same controlled precision as Tae-sung, the same awareness of their surroundings. Security, Sienna realized. These aren't just employees. They're protection. You're very calm, Tae-sung observed as they walked. Most people in your situation would have more questions. I'm terrified, Sienna admitted. But I've learned that panic doesn't solve problems. It just makes them louder. Tony Martins taught you that. Tony taught me a lot of things, she said bitterly. Most of them about what I don't want in my life. They entered a private elevator, larger than the one they'd been trapped in, with dark wood paneling and subtle lighting. The suited men didn't follow, just bowed as the doors closed. He will not stop, Tae-sung said once they were alone again. Men like Tony Martins do not accept rejection. They see it as a challenge to overcome, an obstacle to manage. I know. Sienna's voice was small. I've tried everything. Restraining orders. Changing my number. Moving. But his family has connections. Money. Lawyers who make my legal protections disappear. Legal protections are only effective when the person fears legal consequences, Tae-sung said. His tone was still calm, almost conversational. Tony Martins does not fear the law. He fears humiliation, loss of status, being made irrelevant. The way he said it, clinical, analytical, like he was discussing a business problem rather than her stalker ex-husband, should have felt cold. Instead, it felt hopeful, because Tony was exactly like that. He'd always cared more about appearances than substance, more about what people thought of him than what was actually true. You understand him, Sienna said. I understand men who mistake privilege for power, Tae-sung replied. They are loud because they are insecure, controlling because they are afraid. They harm others because they cannot bear their own insignificance. The contrast between the two men crystallized in Sienna's mind with sudden, sharp clarity. Tony, always talking, always justifying, always needing to prove himself. His anger was hot, explosive, unpredictable. He'd make scenes, raise his voice, slam doors, use his emotions as weapons to keep her off balance. Tae-sung, silent unless he had something worth saying. His power was cold, certain, absolute. He didn't need to raise his voice because people listened the first time. Didn't need to justify himself because his authority was unquestioned. Tony had controlled her through chaos. Tae-sung controlled his world through order. The question was, which was more dangerous? I can end this, Tae-sung said, breaking into her thoughts. Not through violence. Not through anything that would put you at legal risk. But I can make Tony Martins forget you exist. Sienna's heart hammered. How? By making him irrelevant. By removing the foundations of his power, his family's business connections, his social standing, his access to the circles where he feels important. By ensuring that pursuing you costs him everything he values. That's, Sienna struggled to find words. That's not just protection. That's destruction. No, Tae-sung corrected quietly. Destruction would be permanent. This is simply correction. A lesson about consequences. He can rebuild if he's smart enough to learn from it. The elevator slowed, then stopped. What would this cost me? Sienna asked because nothing like this was ever free. She'd learned that much from Tony. Tae-sung turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You would be seen with me, publicly, at business events, social gatherings, for a defined period, 3 months, perhaps 6. Long enough to establish that you are under my protection, that you are associated with my interests. Associated, Sienna repeated carefully. Nothing you do not choose, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. I will not touch you without permission. Will not demand anything beyond your presence at specific occasions. You will have your own space, your own freedom, but publicly you will appear to be someone I have claimed interest in. The word claimed sent a chill down her spine. And if I say no, then you walk away now. I will still ensure Tony is escorted from my property tonight, but tomorrow he will return to your life. And eventually, his persistence will trap you somewhere I cannot intervene. Sienna's hands were shaking again. She pressed them together, trying to still the trembling. This feels like trading one cage for another. Perhaps, Tae-sung acknowledged, but this cage has an exit date, and the lock is on your side. The doors opened onto a rooftop restaurant, intimate, exclusive, the kind of place that didn't take reservations because it didn't need to advertise. The city spread out below them, lights beginning to sparkle as evening approached. You're asking me to trust you, Sienna said. A man I met 30 minutes ago. A man who just admitted to being dangerous. No, Taesung corrected. I'm asking you to make a strategic choice. Trust can develop later, or not at all. This is simply a transaction. Your visibility beside me in exchange for Tony Martins's permanent absence from your life. The elevator door began to close, and Sienna realized this was the moment. Stay in the elevator. Go back down. Return to her tiny apartment and her small business and the constant fear that Tony would show up again. Or step out into Taesung's world and accept that protection always came with strings attached. She thought about the last 6 months. The exhaustion. The fear. The way Tony had stolen her peace even after she'd escaped his presence. She stepped forward. The doors closed behind her with a final, quiet click. And Sienna Carrington realized she'd just made a deal with someone far more dangerous than her ex-husband. The question was whether she'd been saved, or simply caught in a more elegant trap. You've made it this far. Thank you for being part of this journey. Subscribe to Ebony and Pearl Stories for more intense Afro-Korean romance, and drop a comment with your thoughts on Sienna's choice. The rooftop restaurant was unlike anything Sienna had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides, offering a panoramic view of the city as twilight settled over it like a blanket. The interior was all dark wood and soft lighting, with maybe a dozen tables spaced far enough apart that conversations couldn't be overheard. Classical music played quietly in the background, something orchestral that Sienna couldn't name, but felt in her chest. Every table was occupied by people who looked like they belonged here. Men in suits that probably cost more than her car. Women in elegant dresses that moved like water. The kind of people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives before their morning coffee. And they all paused when Taesung entered. Not obviously. No one stared. But Sienna felt the shift, the subtle acknowledgement, the slight inclination of heads, the way conversations paused for just a beat before resuming. This was his world. And everyone in it knew exactly who he was. A hostess appeared immediately, bowing deeply. Mr. Your usual table is ready. Taesung inclined his head and gestured for Sienna to walk ahead of him. She noticed he positioned himself so that he was between her and the room, not possessively, but protectively, like a shield she hadn't asked for, but suddenly felt grateful to have. Their table was in the corner, with a view of the city, but also a clear sight line to the entrance. Tactical, Sienna realized. He'd chosen a position where he could see everything coming. A man approached as they sat, older, Korean, with silver at his temples and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He bowed to Taesung, then spoke in rapid Korean. Taesung's expression darkened slightly. He responded in the same language, his tone clipped, authoritative. The man bowed again and withdrew, pulling out a tablet as he left. What was that about? Sienna asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Hotel security, Taesung said, his voice carefully neutral. I asked them to review footage from the lobby. Sienna's stomach tightened. Tony. Yes. The man returned a moment later, the tablet in hand. He set it on the table, angled so both Taesung and Sienna could see the screen, then stepped back. The footage was black and white, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Tony stood in the lobby, pacing, gesturing wildly at hotel staff. Even without sound, Sienna could see his mouth forming her name. His face was red, his movements agitated. A security guard approached him, clearly attempting to de-escalate, but Tony shoved past him toward the elevators. More security appeared. This time, 3 men in black suits, professional, coordinated, positioned themselves between Tony and the elevator bank. One of them spoke into a radio. Tony's expression shifted from anger to something uglier. He grabbed one security guard's arm, shouting something Sienna couldn't hear but could read in the aggressive set of his shoulders. Then he tried to push past them. The guards didn't use violence. They didn't need to. They simply formed a wall, immovable, and began walking Tony backward toward the exit. He fought the entire way, not physically, but with words, with status, with the entitled belief that he deserved to go wherever he wanted. The footage showed him being escorted out the front doors. But even on the sidewalk, he didn't leave. He stood there, staring at the building, phone pressed to his ear, making calls, pulling strings, refusing to accept that he'd been denied. The timestamp continued. 5 minutes passed. 10. Tony was still there, pacing the sidewalk like a predator waiting for an opening. Taesung tapped the screen, pausing the footage. He has called his family's lawyer twice, his mother once, and 3 business associates who have connections to this hotel's parent company. He's trying to get back inside, Sienna whispered. He will not succeed, Taesung said flatly. But this illustrates my point. Tony Martins does not accept obstacles. He escalates. He weaponizes his connections. He believes that persistence and privilege will eventually wear down any resistance. Sienna stared at the frozen image of Tony on the screen, his face twisted with rage, his hand raised mid-gesture. This was the man she'd spent 2 years with. The man who told her he loved her while systematically dismantling her confidence. The man who'd made her feel like she was crazy for wanting space, unreasonable for having boundaries, ungrateful for not appreciating his care. He'll be outside when I leave, she said quietly. Won't he? Yes. And tomorrow he'll show up at my apartment, or my work, or anywhere else he thinks I might be. Yes. Sienna closed her eyes. She was so tired, bone-deep exhausted from 6 months of running, of hiding, of trying to build a life, while constantly looking over her shoulder. You said you could make him stop, she said, opening her eyes to meet Taesung's steady gaze. Explain exactly what that means. Taesung dismissed the security man with a subtle gesture. Once they were alone, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. Tony's family wealth comes from their position as intermediaries. They facilitate connections between legitimate businesses and less legitimate operations. They trade in access, in discretion, in the appearance of respectability. Money laundering? Sienna asked. Among other things. They are not major players. They survive by being useful to more powerful interests, by maintaining relationships, by never drawing unwanted attention. And if they drew attention, those more powerful interests would cut ties. The family's business would collapse. Their social standing would evaporate. They would become irrelevant. Sienna processed this, her mind working through the implications. You're saying you can destroy his family's business. I'm saying I can make it clear that Tony Martins is a liability, that his inability to control his obsessions makes him dangerous to associate with. Once that message is delivered, his family will handle him themselves. They will cut him off financially, socially, and emotionally if that's what it takes to preserve their position. It was ruthless, calculated, and exactly the kind of consequence Tony would actually fear. And all I have to do is be seen with you, Sienna said slowly. Let people think we're what? Dating. Involved, Taesung corrected. The exact nature is irrelevant. What matters is the perception that you are under my protection, that harming you, or even bothering you, would be a direct insult to me. Sienna's hands trembled in her lap. She clasped them together, trying to still the shaking. This is a lot of power to have over someone's life, she whispered. Yes, Taesung agreed. Which is why I'm giving you a choice. Walk away now. Take your chances with Tony and the legal system. Or accept my offer. 3 months of public association in exchange for permanent freedom from him. 3 months, Sienna repeated. After which you are free to go. Our arrangement ends. You return to your life, and Tony Martins will no longer be part of it. It sounded too good to be true. Too clean. Too simple. Sienna thought about the last 2 years with Tony. How he'd started with small suggestions. Wouldn't you be more comfortable in this dress instead? Then criticism disguised as concern. I just worry that your friends aren't ambitious enough for you. Then isolation. Why do you need other people when you have me? She'd lost herself so gradually that she hadn't noticed until she'd looked in the mirror one day and couldn't recognize the hollow-eyed woman staring back. It had taken everything she had to leave, to reclaim her name, her space, her right to make her own decisions. If I agree, Sienna said carefully, I need conditions. Taesung's expression didn't change, but she saw interest flicker in his eyes. Name them. My business stays mine. You don't invest in it. Don't send clients my way. Don't involve yourself in how I run it. I built it myself, and I'm keeping it that way. Agreed. I keep my apartment. I don't move into your space or give up my independence. Agreed. And if at any point I say I'm done, if this feels like it's crossing lines I'm not comfortable with, we end the arrangement. No questions, no retaliation, no consequences. Taesung studied her for a long moment, and Sienna forced herself to hold his gaze. She wouldn't shrink, wouldn't apologize for having boundaries, wouldn't make herself small to fit into someone else's plans. Never again. You've learned, he said finally, and there was something like approval in his voice. You've learned to negotiate for yourself. I learned what happens when I don't, Sienna replied. Then we have an agreement. Taesung extended his hand across the table. 3 months of public association. Your independence maintained. Clear boundaries respected. And at the end, Tony Martin's will be nothing more than an unpleasant memory. Sienna looked at his hand. Elegant fingers, clean nails, a simple watch that probably cost more than her entire inventory of baking supplies. This was insane. She knew it was insane. But she also knew that Tony wouldn't stop. That legal protections were useless against someone with money and connections. That she was so tired of being afraid. She reached out and shook Taesung's hand. His grip was firm, but not crushing. Warm, but not invasive. He held her hand for exactly the appropriate amount of time, then released it. I'll have my attorney draw up a contract, he said. Something that protects both of us legally. A contract, Sienna repeated, almost wanting to laugh. For a fake relationship. For a business arrangement, Taesung corrected. Which is what this is. I provide protection and social visibility. You provide the perception of association. Everything else is optional. A server appeared with menus, and the moment shifted into something that felt almost normal. Almost like a regular dinner date. Except it wasn't. Because somewhere below them, Tony Martin's was still pacing the sidewalk, making phone calls, refusing to accept defeat. And when he finally learned who Sienna was standing beside, what would he do? Would he finally give up? Or would this escalate into something none of them could control? If this story has you hooked, subscribe to Ebony and Pearl Stories for more. Sienna's journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The first public appearance came 3 days later. Sienna stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the dress Taesung's people had delivered that morning. It was elegant, deep emerald green that complemented her skin, fitted but not restrictive, expensive without being ostentatious. The kind of dress that announced you belonged in certain spaces without needing to shout about it. She barely recognized herself. Her phone buzzed. A message from Taesung. Car arrives in 10 minutes. No pressure. But the contract is signed. He'd been true to his word. The contract had arrived the next day, professionally drafted, clear boundaries outlined, exit clauses that gave her complete autonomy. Her attorney had reviewed it, found nothing predatory, and admitted grudging respect for how thorough it was. This man is either genuinely honorable or extremely good at appearing that way, her attorney had said. Either way, you're legally protected. Legally protected. The phrase felt almost laughable after years of restraining orders that Tony had violated with impunity. Sienna took a deep breath, smoothed down the dress one more time, and grabbed her clutch. Time to find out if she'd made a deal with a savior or just a more sophisticated trap. The charity gala was being held at another of Taesung's hotels, this one even more opulent than the Meridian Grand. Sienna stepped out of the car onto a red carpet lined with photographers and felt her stomach drop. I didn't realize there would be press, she said quietly to Taesung, who'd appeared at her elbow the moment the door opened. That's the point, he replied, offering his arm. Tony needs to see that you're visible. Protected. Claimed. The word claimed still made her skin prickle, but she took his arm anyway. The moment they entered together, she felt it, the shift in attention. Heads turned. Conversations paused. People didn't stare outright, but Sienna could feel eyes tracking them as they moved through the ballroom. Who is she? Someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. Taesung doesn't bring anyone to these events. Another voice responded. She must be important. Taesung's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, not possessive, not controlling, just present. A subtle message to everyone watching. She's with me. And the terrifying part was how safe it made her feel. A man approached, older, white, with the kind of confident smile that came from decades of power. Taesung, good to see you. And who is this lovely young woman? Sienna Carrington. Taesung said, his tone cordial but with an edge that suggested the question had been noted. Sienna, this is Richard Chun, CEO of Pacific Holdings. Sienna shook his hand, forcing herself to smile despite the anxiety clawing at her throat. Pleasure to meet you. Carrington, Richard repeated thoughtfully. Any relation to the Carringtons in Boston?
No, sir.
I'm from here. I run a small dessert business. Small for now, Taesung interjected smoothly. Her work is exceptional. The way he said it, like her success was inevitable, like her business mattered, made something warm unfurl in Sienna's chest. Richard smiled. Well, any friend of Taesung's is worth knowing. Perhaps we could discuss catering options for our next corporate event. Before Sienna could respond, Taesung's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression unchanging, then excused himself briefly. When he returned a few minutes later, there was something different in his eyes. Not satisfaction exactly, but confirmation. What happened? Sienna asked quietly once they were alone at their table. Tony Martins attempted to use his family's connections to gain entry tonight, Taesung said. He was unsuccessful. He's here? Sienna's pulse spiked.
He was.
He's been escorted off the property, along with a message. What kind of message? Taesung's gaze held hers. That his behavior has attracted unwanted attention. That several business associates his family relies on have expressed concerns about his stability. That continued harassment of someone under my protection would have professional consequences for the entire Martins family. Sienna's hands trembled slightly. She set down her wine glass before it could spill. You're destroying his family's business. I'm protecting their business, Taesung corrected, by making it clear that Tony is the liability. What they choose to do with that information is up to them. The answer came the next morning. Sienna was in her apartment kitchen, mixing batter for a new recipe, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Sienna? It was Tony's mother, Victoria Martins. Her voice was cold, clipped, furious. I don't know what you've done, but you need to fix this immediately. Excuse me? Don't play stupid. Tony told me about your new associate. Do you have any idea who you're involving yourself with? What kind of man Taesung is? A man who respects boundaries, Sienna said evenly. Which is more than I can say for your son. Tony loves you. He made mistakes, yes, but he's trying to make amends. He stalked me for 6 months. He showed up at my work. He grabbed me in public. That's not love, Victoria. That's obsession. Well, it ends now, Victoria snapped. We've made arrangements for Tony to spend time abroad. Europe.
Asia.
Somewhere he can reset. He won't be bothering you anymore. Sienna sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. You're sending him away. We're protecting our family's interests, which your new boyfriend made very clear were at risk if Tony continued his behavior. The line went dead. Sienna sat in her quiet kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows, and felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years.
Peace.
The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of galas, dinners, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Sienna learned the rules of Taesung's world, how to read the hierarchies in a room, how to navigate conversations where business was discussed in metaphors, how to recognize the difference between genuine allies and opportunistic predators. Taesung was patient. He never pushed, never demanded. Their relationship remained exactly what the contract specified: professional, bounded, clear. But something was shifting. The way he remembered that she preferred sparkling water over still. How he positioned himself at events so she always had an exit route if she felt overwhelmed. The quiet conversations and car rides between venues where he'd ask about her business, her goals, her life before Tony, and actually listen to her answers. One evening, as they left another event, Sienna realized something startling. She hadn't looked over her shoulder once all day, hadn't checked her phone obsessively for messages from blocked numbers, hadn't mapped out escape routes in her head, hadn't felt that familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach wondering when Tony would appear. "You're smiling," Taesung observed as they settled into the back of his car. "I am," Sienna said, surprised by it herself. "I just realized I feel safe." Something flickered in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or something warmer.
Good.
"Thank you," she said quietly, "for keeping your word, for respecting the boundaries, for not making this into something it isn't." Taesung turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "You should understand something, Sienna. Safety in my world comes with a price." "What kind of price?" "Enemies," he said simply. "People who want to hurt me will look for leverage, and anyone close to me becomes a potential target. That's why I rarely allow people into my personal life. But you allowed me." "I made a business arrangement," he corrected. "One that benefits us both. But the danger is real. Even after our 3 months end, there will be people who remember you were associated with me." Sienna should have felt afraid, should have wanted to run, to protect herself, to choose the safer path. But instead, she thought about the last 3 weeks. The freedom from fear, the ability to walk down the street without constantly checking behind her, the dignity of being treated like a person with agency rather than a possession to be controlled. "I understand," she said, "and I'm staying anyway." Taesung studied her for a long moment. "You've changed." "No," Sienna replied. "I'm just remembering who I was before someone tried to make me smaller." The car pulled up to her apartment. Taesung's driver opened her door, and she stepped out into the cool evening air. Before the door closed, Taesung spoke again.
Sienna.
She turned back. "You were never small," he said quietly. "You were just surrounded by people who needed you to believe you were." The car door closed. The vehicle pulled away, and Sienna Carrington stood on her quiet street, 3 blocks from her tiny apartment above a bakery, wearing a designer dress paid for by a dangerous man who'd somehow given her back something she'd thought was lost forever. Her freedom. She didn't know what loving someone like Taesung would cost, if it ever came to that. She didn't know if this arrangement would end in 3 months or transform into something neither of them had planned for. She didn't know if the safety he offered was real or just another cage with prettier bars. But for the first time in years, when she thought about tomorrow, she wasn't afraid. And that was enough. Thank you for watching Sienna's journey. Subscribe to Ebony and Pearl Stories for more emotional Afro-Korean romance. There's so much more to come, and this is just the beginning.
Hey, beautiful souls. If you've made it to this very moment right here with me, then you already know. Sienna's story touched something in you. And honestly, that means the world to me. I pour my heart into every single story I bring to you. And knowing you stayed until the end, It tells me you felt what I felt when I was creating this. That connection, that's everything. Now, I have to be honest with you. The next story? Oh, it's gonna wreck you in the best way possible. I'm talking about the kind of emotional roller coaster that makes you gasp out loud, the kind that keeps you up at night thinking, what happens next? It's already waiting for you, and I promise you don't want to miss it. That image on your screen right now? Click it. Trust me, your heart will thank you later. And before you go, because I know some of you beautiful people are about to disappear on me, can you do me one tiny favor? Drop a comment and tell me where in this beautiful world you're watching from. I read every single one, and it makes my day knowing this little community we're building reaches across cities, countries, continents. If you haven't said hi yet, this is your moment. Don't be shy. Let me know you're here. Because honestly, your presence matters. You matter. All right, my love, go ahead and click that next story. I'll see you there.